Father, I'll begin by asking you to give us your name and just tell us your full name, Father.
I am Jim Reuter of the Society of Jesus.
Arthur Francis
Bill Kreutz. Edmundo Martinez.
Francis X. Clark,
John Krebs,
Luigi Moigi,
Arthur Andrew Bauer,
Miguel Anselmo Bernat. My name is Honesto. My middle name is Chavez. And last name Pagana.
I'm Roque Angel Ferrios Iglesias.
Father, we begin once again. So I will ask you to say a few things about yourself, your name, where you came from, and when you first arrived in the Philippines.
Well, my name is Father Jack Schumacher. I was born in Buffalo, New York, and right after high school entered the Society of Jesus. And 4 years later, in 1948, I came here to Sacred Heart Novitiate to study philosophy and then to teach for 3 years. Since in those days that we had no school of theology here, all of us, Americans and Filipinos, went to Woodstock College in Maryland for our studies. And then I did my graduate studies in history, partly in Spain and at Georgetown University in Washington. So I've been here in the Philippines 50 years now, with the exception of the 10 years I spent abroad studying. I teach church history, and most of my research has been in Philippine history and Philippine church history here at Loyola School of Theology.
Father, your vocation as a historian, is that something you stumbled into, or was that something you've always wanted to do?
No, I kind of stumbled into it. Father Frank Clark, who is still doing, in his 80s, doing some writing of history, was one of our professors out at Sacred Heart Novitiate, and he encouraged us to take part in a seminar on Rizal, which interested me very much to find out about the background of the Philippines that I knew, which was all in ruins right after the war. Then later, when I was going to go to graduate studies, they said, well, we need somebody in church history. So I said, okay, I'll go. But I've enjoyed it. I like history, and since I teach in a school of theology, I think it's a great help, as many of my students have said, to make their theology real, to see the historical context it came out of.
Father, within your specialization of Philippine church history, you've also concentrated a lot on Jesuit history in the Philippines, no? Because you've been giving a lot of talks in this subject. So I was wondering, if we looked at the entire history of the Jesuits in the Philippines, into how many sections, how many eras, if you wish, should we divide the history?
To divide up the history of the Jesuits in the Philippines, I think perhaps the most convenient way is according to the different nationalities who've been carrying out the Jesuit mission here. Of course, it was the Spanish Jesuits who first came here in 1581 and set up their first house in Lagio, which we think is someplace between Malate and Ermita, a little fishing village at that time. The Spanish Jesuits were here until 1768, working mostly in the Visayas and Mindanao. The King of Spain, for reasons which have nothing to do with the Philippines, expelled all Jesuits from Spanish dominions in 1768. Then when Spain, which had never really occupied Mindanao, much less Sulu, began to fear that other European powers would take it over in the 19th century, they asked the Jesuits to come back and to evangelize the people that we refer to as Lumads today, the people who were in the interior, and to work with the Muslims. That lasted up until 1898. Then you have the Spanish Jesuits continued, but of course with much smaller numbers and with no more support from the government from 1898 until 1921. And by that time, everything had changed in the Philippines. People were predominantly speaking English, and it was finally decided that the Spanish Jesuits would go off to Bombay to work in India, and the American Jesuits from New York and Maryland would come here to teach, to take over the works as much as they could. The American period then is characterized by a large number of vocations of Filipinos, though the Jesuits had opened a novitiate in 1906. There were only a small number coming from Spanish-speaking families up until the 1930s, and then large numbers, especially from the Ateneo de Manila, was the only Ateneo at that time, began to enter the novitiate. Things looked very prosperous at that point, but of course then came the war. And though the American Jesuits, who were almost all the older Jesuits were American, though they were able to stay out of internment camp for a couple of years under a kind of house arrest, finally the Japanese interned them all in Los Baños, or at the Santo Tomas camp. And the war was a period which again changed the focus of the Jesuits here, namely that when the Americans were all gone, the Filipinos, even if they were not yet priests, began to administer things and to make the decisions that were necessary. And but on the other hand, you lost many of the Americans who were sick from what they had suffered during the war. The more American Jesuits came after the war. And that was a period when we opened a number of provincial Ateneos, the latest of which to become a university was the Ateneo de Naga, which was opened in 1941, just before the war broke. In that, as time went on, and there were more and more Filipinos who had their degrees, the school system expanded considerably. The next period really is from, or overlapping with that period, is after 1949, when the Jesuits were expelled from China, of many nationalities, Europeans mostly, or young Chinese, and they took over many of the parishes in Mindanao, learned Visayan, and began to work in Mindanao. So again, our work spread in Mindanao considerably. However, they all have gotten old and are mostly in the infirmary by now. Those were people who came out in 1949. And the number of Filipinos continued to increase until about 1970, when there was a kind of lapse in vocations most everywhere, partly because of reactions to Vatican II, partly because of the student activism which hit the Philippines as well as most of the rest of the world around 1970, and then martial law. And since then, the number of Filipino Jesuits has continued to grow, but not as fast as the Americans have begun to die off. I was one of the young ones, and now 71. So but gradually we have, in this period, both for reasons of lack of personnel and for reasons of what Vatican II had to say about our lay helpers being brought more into the running of our apostolates. More and more our schools are under lay deans or vice presidents and so on. And there's much more cooperation between Jesuits and lay people, rather than lay people just looking to Jesuits for directions to which to go. So I think those are the main. We're now in the period of the end of Americanization and the full Filipinization of the province, in which we can see by the fact that Filipino Jesuits are now going to places like Cambodia and to Africa to help less developed countries who are in need.
So, Father, you mentioned that the first era of the Jesuit history in the Philippines would be the first Spanish period. How long did this first era last? What would you say would be the years that covered this period?
Well, of course, the Jesuits were not to look at the first period of the Spanish Jesuits. The Jesuits were not the first missionaries to come here. The Augustinians and Franciscans had come before them, but the Spanish king asked the Jesuits be sent also, and the first ones arrived here in 1581, having worked in Mexico before that. As I mentioned before, they settled at a place like Lagio, called Lagio, and in the beginning they really didn't know how they should go about doing things. However, the bishop, a Dominican bishop, Domingo de Salazar, who had come with the Jesuits, asked them to open a college to train his priests. Since they were only 2 priests and 1 brother, they were not in any position to open a college. But in 1595, more men came, and they did open a college in Manila, which in later years would come to be called the Colegio de San Ignacio, after St. Ignatius was canonized. With this, they began to train both lay people and priests. It was fairly small in that beginning. At the same time, about 1595, the king divided up the country so that each religious order would have an area in which to work. And the Jesuits worked in the area over near Antipolo, Taytay, in the Tagalog region. And then in the Visayas, Samar, Leyte, Bohol, and northern Mindanao, where the people were mostly immigrants from Bohol. Dapitan was perhaps the first of their major parishes there. Here they had to begin with acquainting people with Christianity. The conquistadores had been there before them, and people's memories of the conquistadores were not very good. And of course they associated the fathers with the other Spaniards. So there are many places it took a lot of time and patience to get themselves accepted, and then for people to be ready to listen to them. Of course, knowing the geography of the Visayas, there were plenty of problems about moving around from place to place, and they never got into the interior of the bigger islands. It was mostly along the coast, which is where most Filipinos lived when the Spaniards came. They used methods similar to those of the other orders, but you might say that since the Jesuits were known in Europe for running schools, they had a more systematic approach to, once people showed an interest in Christianity, they set up a method by which they would learn the Christian doctrine, memorize it first of all, but then be asked questions on it. And they were not in a hurry to baptize people. They insisted that not only they know the essence of Christianity, but that they give up customs which were incompatible with Christianity, like polygamy and the ritual drunkenness which used to accompany the sacrifices to the Anito and Diwata. In some places, you find many different approaches depending on the ingenuity of the missionary. One of the fathers who went to Bohol, where they built the first church in Bohol, it's not still there, but it's the one in Baclayan. It's the first place they built a church. And there they had some success, but then when they tried to go further into the Bukid, the Datus came and told them, we don't want Christianity in the Bukid. You know? And so this missionary said, no, you don't have to take it, let's just talk about things. And so he talked about their farming and how he had been a farmer back in Spain. And then when he had the first Mass which they attended, he turned around after the gospel and took some gold dust and threw it on the ground and trampled it into the ground. And he said, you know, I want you to know I didn't come here to look for your gold, but for your souls. And well, all the other Spaniards who'd been there had been anxious to find any gold they could find. And that made it, you know, it was kind of an audiovisual aid that made an impression on people. Another story told by one father in Mindoro, he was...
Okay, Father, we'll take it from the story in Mindoro. You were beginning to tell us a story of an experience of a Jesuit missionary in Mindoro. Would you like to tell us about
it? One of the places where the Jesuits had missions for a time was in Mindoro. And here they had converted a number of people. But there was one old woman who kept, though she was friendly, she said, no, I can't accept your religion. You're not related to me, and we come from different families and different barangays, and therefore that's not possible. So he thought, and he said, no, we are relatives. And so how is that? And he said, well, you know, you go back to Adam and Eve, and then he traced from Adam and Eve down through the generations that are found in the Bible. And he says, and we all come from the same father and mother, so we are relatives. Well, she was impressed by that, and she agreed to start studying Christian doctrine. The work in the Visayas, of course, was much more difficult than the work in the Tagalog regions. In the Tagalog region, you were close to Manila, and things were available. In the Visayas, it took sometimes months to get anything down there. And then, of course, there was the problem of the Spaniards had tried to take Sulu when they first came here, and the Muslims were hostile, and of course the Spaniards were hostile to Muslims from their own experience of Arab occupation of Spain during 7 centuries. So that the slave raiders from Sulu and from Maguindanao harassed the Visayas considerably, burning churches, carrying off Visayan Christians to slavery. And in some cases they captured the missionary. One old father, Father Bilanci, an Italian, was captured and taken to Sulu, and they thought about ransoming him, and he wrote back saying, "Never mind, I'm already too old, it's not worth spending the money, you can use it on better things, and besides, I have an apostolate here taking care of the Christian slaves here in Sulu." And they did try to ransom him, but he died before they got there. It might seem surprising that there was an Italian there, but in fact the Spanish Jesuits pretty soon found that they could not get enough Spaniards to staff all of their missions. They had all the missions of Latin America, and so that unlike the other orders, they got permission from the king to bring in people from Jesuits from countries which were allied with Spain. So you find Austrians, Bohemians, Italians, Portuguese working here in the Philippines. Many of them changed their names to make them more intelligible to Filipinos and even to Spaniards. We know a German by the name of Father Schwarzenberg, which means Black Mountain in German. So he changed it to Ignacio del Monte, Hispanizing it. The first step, that first generation, was all to introduce first to interest people in Christianity, which did not prove to be too difficult. You might say Filipino culture at that time was open to a higher culture, and precisely for that reason, Islam had come in the previous century and begun to move up even to Manila just as the Spaniards came. So they, once people agreed to become Christians, they would insist on, as I mentioned before, they're memorizing the whole Doctrina Christiana, which was all the ordinary prayers that we say, and the questions of the Catechism. And the first catechisms were printed in Filipino characters, the syllabary, the Filipino syllabary, with the Roman letters next to it. But very, very quickly, Filipinos adopted the Roman alphabet, and many books were printed. Not too many have survived, since they were printed on rice paper and so on. They did not last too long. But they tell how everybody knew how to read and write, especially the women, though they didn't write down their epics or literature, because they wrote on things like bamboo or banana leaves. They did write notes to each other or keep accounts, and from this, they quickly picked up the Spanish way of writing in their own languages. Missionaries always taught in the languages of the Filipinos, in spite of the regulation from the emperor that they should teach in Spanish. They said, who are they going to speak Spanish to except the missionaries, so that they taught them in their own language. which has preserved Filipino languages up to the present. In the second step, they would test them for their fidelity to Christian morality. As I said, they had to give up their, those who were polygamous had to give up their other wives, which was a problem, especially because they had to give back the dowry, which became very expensive to pay back the parents of the former wife. They also had to give up any slaves which had been unjustly taken. The missionaries came to realize that Filipino slavery, so-called, was not the same as slavery in Europe. And to distinguish between the alipin sa gigilid and the alipin namamahay, who though they abolished the alipin sa gigilid, the alipin namamahay, they hoped that little by little people would free their alipin, and so by the end of the 17th century, the system disappeared. One of the factors which was most extraordinary, I think, in the history of missions anywhere, was the Synod of Manila, or Council of Manila of 1582, where the ecclesiastics from all the different religious orders, together with the bishop, came together to consider how justice was being done in the Philippines. And they went through everybody from the Governor General down to the lowest soldier, and what robbery he had done to Filipinos, or what his wife had done, or what injuries he might have done to them, and insisted that all of them pay restitution to the Filipinos. And I think that idea of that there was one justice for Filipinos and for Spaniards was something that convinced the many Filipinos that it was the missionaries who had their interests at heart, and therefore disposed them towards looking well on Christianity.
Father, you mentioned earlier that the Muslims from Sulu would attack the parishes, including the Jesuit parishes. Do we have anecdotes or documents of some of the ways that the Jesuit parishes try to defend themselves against these slave traders?
Well, by the middle of the 17th century, they had begun to build forts and watchtowers so that they could see if there were any slave raiding ships coming in. The forts, of course, the missionary had to lead the people in building them. They were not used to building in stone, and therefore he supplied the direction for it. Some of in some places, the churches themselves were kind of a fort where people would all take refuge when they saw that a slave raid was coming in. There were a few missionaries, one by the name of Father Jose Ducos, who was parish priest of Iligan in northern Mindanao, who became known as El Padre Capitan. His father had been a military man, and he organized a fleet with some help from Cebu, and he drove back the fleets coming from Sulu and Maguindanao, and at the same time allied himself with the so-called Monteses or Bukidnon, who are not yet Christians, to push back the Maranaos, and he really saved northern Mindanao from from having Christianity wiped out. Not everybody was up to that kind of leading an army, and the fleet even had a spy system which went in to find out when there were raids due to come. But as I say, not everybody was capable of that, and we have long lists of missionaries, both Jesuit and Recoleto. The Recoletos came later and took over the other side of northern Mindanao from Cagayan over to Caraga. Was Recoleto territory, where the Jesuits were from Iligan down to Zamboanga, which was founded in 1636 with the fort of Nuestra Senora del Pilar, which of course is still there. You know? And this helped a great deal in at least lessening the severity of the raids and in protecting the Visayas from such slave raids or piracy. It was simply that the Moro Vintas were faster than anything that the Spaniards had, and the Spaniards only had success in the 19th century, about 1850, when they brought in steamships, among the first steamships, and then put an end to all of that slave raiding. Therefore, in the Visayas, you may say people did not get the same level of deepening Catholicism, though they were very close to their parish priests. Churches were built, and then churches were burned, and people were scattered, and Christians were carried off and never came back again or were killed. So that you didn't have the kind of mature Christian development that you find in the 18th century in Luzon. One of the, I think, more interesting things where it shows how the development was the work both of the missionaries and of the Filipinos is the appearance of the Passion in 1703. Undoubtedly, the story of the Passion came from Spanish books, but the putting it into Tagalog verse was the work of the printer of the Jesuit College of Manila, Gaspar Quino de Belen. And this became something which was sung all the time. All the missionaries remarked how Filipinos loved to sing, that they sang while they were fishing, while they were rowing, while they were working in the fields. And of course, the songs were about the old gods and goddesses, but the missionaries tried to put Christian words to the songs, and people kept the songs, and in that way, it was another way of learning Christian doctrine. But we find that the towns in Luzon very by the 18th century were highly developed. For example, the Jesuits were in Cavite, and even today, if you go to Silang, Cavite, you will see the retablo behind the altar. And in the niches are, besides other saints, are all the Jesuit saints there. Although there's a diocesan priest who's the parish priest there now, the Jesuits left all their saints behind to keep an eye on Silang, as it were. We find many books being written, both by missionaries and by Filipinos, especially in Tagalog and Cebuano, but also in the lesser language, Philippine languages. And then there's a whole liturgical cycle in which the town took part, much of which is still with us today. The celebration of Christmas, which is so characteristically Filipino, you don't find it anywhere else in the world. The celebration of Holy Week, again, though when I was in Spain, I could see the origins of some of the practices here. They've all been Filipinized here and become part of Filipino culture and Filipino way of worshiping God.
So, Father, let's talk a little bit about the printing press of the Jesuits in Manila.
Well, the printing press had been put in there quite early. The Dominicans also had one at San Tomas. You had the two universities by this time, and by the beginning of the 18th century, San Tomas and San Ignacio. The printing press was mostly used for printing devotional books, catechisms, prayer books of all kind. People remark how, foreigners coming to the Philippines in that period of the late 17th and 18th century remark how Filipinos are always reading. They keep their books and read them, and even when the books begin to wear out, they copy them out. And I've seen some of those handwritten little devocionarios, as they call them. But apart from the religious books, the presses were important for the dictionaries and grammars and that they printed. I mean, as early as 1593, we had the first grammar of Tagalog and of Chinese. And, they were printed by the Chinese method of a wooden block with the characters carved on it. But then by 1610, there were printing presses in in Manila, and they began to turn out, especially these grammars and dictionaries. Some of the dictionaries, some scholars now precisely are going back to these early dictionaries to find out that words meant something very different in the 17th century than they do today. It's not only that fact, but also the fact that they give you an example of how the word is used, and from the example they use, you learn a good deal about Filipino culture at that time, you know, in small things. Apart from the religious and the religious books and the dictionaries, there were a number of other books on medicine which were printed. The most outstanding is that of Brother George Kamel, after whom the flower camellia has been named, who was in correspondence with scholars in Europe, telling the different species he found here, and he had a whole botica of herbal medicines that he gave free to the poor who came to the University of San Ignacio. And certainly he made major contributions to botany and biology. Of course, apart from that, there were a few works of general literature, but usually with a moral lesson connected to them. But numbers of European books were translated into Philippine languages, especially Tagalog, as they say. The second half of the 17th century and the first half of the 18th century, we might see the maturing of Philippine Catholicism. It was no longer evangelizing, except up in the Cordillera in the north, but the Jesuits were not in that area. But we find that villages had their, as I mentioned, their whole liturgical cycle, and a whole series of practices, choirs, musical instruments, to play music at Mass. We find the mention of organs and so on. You wonder how anybody brought an organ all the way from Europe. But then I found recently that many of the organs were constructed here. Of course, the most well-known one is the bamboo organ out in Las Piñas. But both European and Filipino musical instruments were made use of. Coming to the Philippines from Mexico, the Spanish ships always stopped at Guam, and Magellan had stopped there, and the people of Guam, the Chamorros, who had no iron, had tried to take the nails out of his ship so that they could melt them down for iron, and therefore he called the islands the Ladrones, the island of thieves. But nobody ever tried to evangelize the what we now know today as the Marianas Islands. Father Diego de San Vitores, who has just been beatified a couple of years ago, when he passed by there, as they always pass by to take on water for the rest of the trip, he saw all these people and he resolved to do something about it. His father was of the nobility in Spain, and they persuaded the Queen to open a mission in the Marianas. And of course, since her name was Maria Ana, they named the islands after her, rather than Ladrones, which was not very complimentary. San Vitores came here to Manila. He worked for a while in Mindoro and in the University of San Ignacio, but he was preparing for a mission to the Marianas. And as I say, he was beatified a couple of years ago, but when I read the accounts, I said, you know, there were a number of Filipinos with him, and we have discovered that there is one who was his companion and was killed at the same time that San Vitores was, Pedro Calungsod. The accounts only tell us he was a Visayan. Now, when I was down in Cebu some months ago, Cardinal Vidal is very interested in saying that he was born in Cebu, where there's some people over in Iloilo, and they say, no, our family name is Calungsod, and he must be from our family. But in any case, he was Filipino who volunteered to go to and accompany San Vitores. And San Vitores had lost his eyeglasses when he first got there, so he couldn't see anything, and they used to lead him around by a rope. So when they came to attack him for having baptized a little girl, he couldn't run away. He could just stand there and be killed. Calungsod could have run away, but he didn't. He stayed right there, and therefore he's a martyr, and they're hoping that if the Pope makes his trip to Asia, that he might beatify him also. There was also another Pampango, Felipe Sonson, who volunteered to go with San Vitores, and who worked very closely with him all the time that they were in the Marianas for some 30 years. He was also hacked to death, but he didn't die until 3 months later, so that he's not a martyr, though we know much more about his life story and what he did before he went to the Marianas. But in his, it's very clear, he went as a missionary, to bring the gospel to other peoples. So that you can see this is a mature church. It's looking not only to be Christian, but to bring the gospel to others. Another event which shows the maturity and which is connected with the Jesuits at that time is that in 1684, a girl who took the name of Ignacia del Espiritu Santo, whose father was a Chinese and mother a Tagalog, went off by herself. Her parents wanted her to marry, and she wanted to live a form of religious life. And she went and lived by herself for a while, supporting herself by her needle and thread, and gradually gathering other women around her, so that by the time she died in 1748, you had this Beaterio, which everybody called the Beaterio de la Compañía de Jesus, because it was right across from the Jesuit Church of San Ignacio, and the Beatas, as the women were called, used to go over there every day for Mass and for prayer and so on. And they then begin to give retreats in the Beaterio. We still have Beaterio Street down in Intramuros, where the pre-war Beaterio was. And they said as many as 2,000 or 3,000 women a year would come from the Tagalog provinces, and even some Spaniards. The governor writes that his wife made a 8-day silent retreat there with the Filipino women in the Beaterio that year. So again, you have they weren't allowed to found a religious order because the Patronato Real did not allow that. But they lived the life. They took the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and they lived the life of religious, and they carried on an apostolate among their fellow Filipinos all during that time. One sees also the reaction of other Filipinos, that both Filipinos and Spaniards contributed to supporting the group. It tells how they went up to Pampanga to beg for rice, and the people gave them 2 bancas full of rice and told them they could keep the bancas also. So that too, there were other groups like the Beaterio of Santo Domingo and of San Sebastian, which follow in the years following that. But the one which has been most influential and has lasted right up to today, where it's the RVM sisters, as they're known, the Religious of the Virgin Mary, dates right back to that time. The third thing that happens right about this time to show the maturing of Filipino Catholicism is the ordaining of the first Filipino priests. This year we celebrated the ordination, third centenary of the ordination of the first Filipino priests. Unfortunately, it seems there were no Filipinos admitted to the priesthood in the religious orders, except right near the end of the 19th century, the Jesuits admitted a couple, but it was not significant. It would take the American period before there would be Filipinos in the religious orders. Everything, therefore, at this time seemed settled, that even Jesuits had been able to make friends with the Sultan of Sulu, and he used to come over to Zamboanga and speak Arabic to one of the German fathers who was there, who knew Arabic, and he invited them to come over, and some Jesuits to come over and live in Sulu. However, others were not as well disposed as he, and eventually they had to leave. But they were beginning to make good Christian-Muslim relations. It was a slow process, but things were changing. It's at that point that you have, as far as the Jesuits are concerned, the end of this period. Beginning from about 1750, under the influence of the Enlightenment in Europe, there's an effort to bring the church under the kings and what we know as enlightened despotism in church history. And since the Jesuits were the least dependent on the kings, being more dependent on the Pope, they were the ones who were primarily attacked. They were also the biggest group. So first in Portugal, and then in Spain, in France, and then finally in Spain under the pretext that they had been behind a riot which took place in Madrid. They were expelled in one night from all Spanish lands in 1767. Well, of course, given the mail, the note didn't get here to Manila until 1768, and they were all put on ships to go across the Pacific, across Mexico, then across the Atlantic, and finally to be left in the Papal States in central Italy. Many of them suffered a good deal on the way. They were greatly crowded on the ships, and they ran into typhoons, and some of those who were unable to stay at all simply were left behind here in the Dominican house till they died. With that, the Jesuits were restored in Spain in 1815 after the end of the Napoleon's empire. They never had enough men to come here to the Philippines, and they were expelled from Spain again in 1823 and 1855. Though they did exist in Spain for a certain amount of time, they could not come here. And as I said earlier, it was only when the French tried to buy Basilan from the Sultan of Sulu, and the Germans and British were looking in to take over southern Mindanao, that the Spanish crown looked for missionaries to establish a Spanish presence in Mindanao. And this is what brings the Jesuits to the Philippines in 1859.
So, Father, do we have any accounts of how the news of the expulsion, the suppression, was received in different houses here in the Philippines?
Well, as in Spain, their first knowledge of it was when troops surrounded the house in the middle of the night and called the superior down to tell them that they were all under arrest. So they were kept there in Manila. They were kept there, and while an inventory was made of all their property, because all their property was to be confiscated, and everybody wanted to find the wealth of the Jesuits, but it's like the gold of Yamashita. Nobody ever found it. What they tried to do was to send off a messenger. They didn't make any resistance. But they were afraid that there would be revolts in the Visayas if the Jesuit priests were taken away. And therefore they managed to get some Filipino to go down to Samar and inform the missionaries there and have them inform the others in Visayas. Even in spite of this, when they took them away from the Visayas and brought them to Manila, preparatory to shipping them out, in a lot of places there was unrest, and people were the Jesuits, if they had wanted to, could really have stirred the people up to revolt against what was being done. After all, there were not very many Spanish troops in the Philippines, and people were kept loyal to Spain mostly by the missionaries. The effects of it were quite disastrous, more so in some places than others. By this time there were a small number of Filipino diocesan priests, and they took over the Jesuit parishes in Cavite and in Antipolo, and also Marinduque, so the Tagalog parishes. But for the Visayas, there was really nobody, and the Recoletos took over the rest of northern Mindanao. But of course, that meant just taking their number and stretching it over twice as many parishes as they'd had before. So since they also took over Bohol, they were not able really to fill all the places, and it was a strong step backward for the missions down there. In the rest of the Visayas, other orders were sent to Samar and Leyte, but of course they didn't know the language. They had been working in other parts of Luzon, and most of them pulled out fairly soon. And this is when you have this mass ordination of Filipino priests, in which with little or no training, the Archbishop of Manila ordained large numbers of Filipinos to the priesthood to be able to fill up the parishes. There was a joke that went around Manila at that time. There are no more boatmen on the Pasig because the Archbishop has ordained them all. But it was disastrous for the Filipino clergy, which up to that time had been well formed in the University of San Ignacio or Santo Tomas, and had shown themselves competent. But it confirmed all the prejudices of Spaniards against Filipino priests. The other disasters, of course, were with the schools. The University of San Ignacio had next to it the University of San Ignacio, which was situated approximately where the Pamantasan ng Lungsod ng Manila is today, had next to it the Colegio de San Jose, which was a boarding school whose students attended the University of San Ignacio. And the Archbishop tried to take these over and found a seminary. He got the university, but the Colegio continued under the diocesan clergy. All of the things which were confiscated at that time were named after the King of Spain, Carlos III. So this is the beginning of San Carlos Seminary here in Manila. Similarly, in Cebu, the Jesuits had, right back in 1595, when Father Cedeno, the superior of the first Jesuits, had founded the College of Manila. He had also founded a small college in Cebu, and that was known as the College of San Ildefonso. This was turned over to the Bishop of Cebu for a seminary, and it became the Seminary de San Carlos, which of course still exists today. The house of the Jesuits down there, it was a very small house in the beginning, of course. There were only 3 or 4 Jesuits there in Cebu. And we know the location of the house there in Cebu even now. There were other Jesuit colleges in Iloilo, in Cavite, in Marinduque, in Santa Cruz, Manila, but none of these were really much more than primary schools where they were taught in Spanish instead of being taught in Tagalog or Cebuano. All of these disappeared with the departure of the Jesuits. It's particularly Mindanao, which was abandoned for the most part as a result of this, and Spanish control of Mindanao was almost nothing except certain points on the north coast. This departure of the Jesuits and the mass ordinations of Filipino priests led to a general disaster for the Philippine Church. Missionaries couldn't come anymore of the other orders because of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars in Spain. There were not enough priests to go around at a time when the population was growing very rapidly. And of course, the first thing to go were the parish schools, and many of the old churches fell into ruins for lack of anybody to take care of them. And it's at a time like this, we should put what later would be found wrong about the Philippine Church. You often hear people say, even people who are supposed to be historians, that the Spaniards only gave a veneer of Christianity to the Filipinos. And as we've tried to show of the Jesuits, and it was true generally of the other orders also, this was not true. There was a thorough evangelization, and you had a mature church at the middle of the 18th century. But then you have a decay which goes on right up until the middle of the 19th century, and the time that remained before the revolution was not enough to recover all that had been lost, and therefore it was natural that many people fell into superstition, and they continued their old practices, but there was nobody to teach them, and so on. When, as I mentioned earlier, it was really the fear for the future, political future of the Philippines that made the Jesuits be brought back. In Spain itself, all the religious orders had been suppressed in 1836, and their property was confiscated. But the four friar orders who were here in the Philippines were each allowed to keep one house as a novitiate to prepare missionaries to go to the Philippines and to stay in the Philippines, but not to work in Spain. So that when it was decided to send Jesuits to Mindanao, they were given back the old castle of Loyola as a house of formation for their men, and that was in 1852. It took them about 7 years before they had enough to send one mission to the Philippines in 1859. When they got here to Manila, as they had anticipated might happen, people asked them to open a college in Manila. There was a college, the so-called Escuela Pia or Escuela Municipal, but it was basically a primary school and for Spaniards. The Jesuits took it over and named it Ateneo Municipal, and by 1865 they made it a secondary school as well, which would be up to our second-year college today, and admitted Filipinos. Of course, one of the earliest graduates was Jose Rizal, not the very first class, but just a couple of years after they had begun to admit Filipinos. The other Jesuits were sent to Mindanao. They wanted to begin in the more settled towns like Zamboanga, but the government wanted them to be in the Muslim area of Cotabato, which had just been occupied by Spanish troops. And that's where they set themselves up with a mission to the Tururay in the mountains, and a delicate relationship with the Maguindanaos, who were right next to them, the present site of Cotabato City. The Jesuits called their place Tamuntaka. And here, when the cholera epidemic hit the Maguindanaos in the 1870s, they got the idea of ransoming slaves from the orphans from the Maguindanaos and bringing them up as Christians in the orphanage of Tamuntaka. Later, the sisters from the Beaterio, the RVM sisters, came down to run the orphanage for girls, and the Jesuits the one for boys. They taught them to farm, and they taught them Spanish and brought them up. And when they got to a certain age, since the boys and girls were kept totally separate from each other. They didn't know each other, but when they got to the age of marriage, the Jesuits and the Beatas got together and suggested who might be a good husband and wife for each other. And some years ago, a friend of mine interviewed some of the old survivors from there, this was back in the 1950s, and they insisted that these marriages were very good and very stable. Of course, it was the Filipino custom at the time that the parents arranged the marriage. And these people were given a carabao and a piece of land and seed rice, and they became farmers in their own right, at which the Magindanaos were much influenced to see that their former slaves were now prosperous farmers, speaking Spanish and educated in a way which the Magindanaos themselves were not. So that good relations came between the Jesuits and most of the Magindanaos. Father Jacinto Juan Martí wrote the first grammar of the Maguindanao language, and Father Ignacio Guirico did the first grammar of the Tururay language. And they had them, the Maguindanao one was printed in Singapore in Arabic characters, and again made a big impression. And had the revolution not come, it well could be that there would have been even conversions among the Magindanaos.
Father, how would you distinguish the works of the Jesuits in the second and Spanish period compared to the Jesuits of the first? Would you say that there were major differences in terms of ministries as well as in terms of geographical coverage?
Well, if we compare the work of the Jesuits in the second period with that of the first, they did not go back to any of their old parishes, except those in Mindanao. All those of the Visayas had been turned over to the diocesan clergy or to other religious orders. And they didn't get back any of their property, their haciendas, or anything of that nature. So they were very much dependent. Say in the first period, they were able to support themselves to a large extent from the haciendas, but in the second period, they were dependent on the government giving them money and rice for each parish priest and for each brother who worked with him in Mindanao. Of course, they also begged for money back in Spain, but that was always uncertain. The people were generally poor, and they tried to clothe them, especially the more primitive people, and to bring them clothes and let them settle down, like lowland Filipinos in Luzon did. Now, that didn't take place right away, but at least they persuaded them to move they tried to create towns the same way as in the 17th century they had created towns in Luzon.
Okay, Father, let's talk about the hacienda possessions of the Jesuits in the first Spanish period. Perhaps you can give us some idea of the coverage or the extent of the hacienda possession property.
Well, actually, there was really no way to raise money for the work of evangelization, though the parish priests got a stipend from the king for such things as schools and especially the universities. There was no source of money. At least in the case of the Jesuits, they didn't charge any tuition, and therefore there had to be some other kind of endowment. With this, they bought lands from Filipinos, or were given lands by Filipinos, and of course the population in the 16th century was perhaps only 500,000 for the whole of the Philippines. So there was plenty of vacant land which could be obtained, and all the orders except the Franciscans built up haciendas mostly around Manila. It's often thought that they were land grants, but in fact the only land grant was in Cebu, where Legazpi gave the Augustinians a small hacienda when they first arrived. The others were obtained by buying them or by donation, and were mostly in Cavite, Laguna, and Bulacan, where places close to Manila. The government encouraged them because it was there was a need to grow food for the city. You know, the ordinary Filipino had grown his own food, but hadn't grown anything to sell, just for his family. Where once you got the people in the city and people who didn't work, I think the Spaniards didn't, they all became hidalgos when they came to the Philippines, and they couldn't soil their hands with farm work. They there had to be some source for feeding them. The Jesuits eventually acquired haciendas in places which are all part of Metro Manila today. Makati, which after their expulsion was sold by the government to the Ayalas and the Rojasas. And Marikina, which is why we still have the chapel of Jesus de la Peña down there, which was the Hacienda Chapel. San Mateo, even probably the Ateneo campus here was part of the Marikina Hacienda. The Dominicans were mostly in Bulacan and Laguna. For the Colegio de San Jose, the founder of the Colegio de San Jose, Don Esteban Rodriguez de Figueroa, had provided that it should be an institution to prepare people for the priesthood or for other civil vocations. And he had not given it to the Jesuits, but made the Jesuits the perpetual administrators of it. It was a trust, to put it into modern terms, or an obra pia, as the Spaniards called it. This had haciendas in Batangas, in Calatagan, Nasugbu, Liang, and those haciendas in general, Filipinos, you might say, preferred to work on the haciendas, because those working on the haciendas were exempt from the compulsory labor which every Filipino had to do in shipbuilding and cutting trees to bring down to the Cavite Navy Yard, and other kinds of very difficult and often abusive labor. So there was no problem on the part of Filipinos in the early period of the haciendas. In the middle of the 18th century, there was a revolt. The people of Silang revolted against the Dominican hacienda of Binyan, and the Dominicans said it was the Jesuit parish priest of Silang who was behind it. But what you see here is there were really two different systems of landholding. For the Spaniards, basing themselves on Roman law, they had titles, written titles, and so on. For the Filipinos, they marked their lands by means of this tree or this rock or this river or whatever it was. And so there was a tendency for the haciendas to encroach on the common lands of Filipinos, which were used only for grazing, and that's what brought about the revolts in several places in the Tagalog region in the 18th century.
Excuse me, Father. Okay, Father. So these vast land holdings were all lost when the Jesuits fell.
They were all confiscated by these haciendas were all confiscated by the government, with the exception of the haciendas of San Jose, which did not belong to the Jesuits, and they continued under the secular priests. But the government couldn't do anything with them. I mean, they needed labor to work the haciendas. There was no point in having land if you couldn't use it. And gradually they find that they lease it out and eventually sell it to families like the Tuaslans, the Ayalas, the Rojas, Zobel, all the big landowning families. Of course, they're all in urban areas today, or they're where the land was not good. Payatas, for example, was abandoned it belongs to the government, but it's been abandoned as a garbage dump. But those in the middle of the city eventually all became part of the city. In many ways, it was a great benefit for the Jesuits that all their haciendas were confiscated, because by the end of the 19th century, export agriculture was developing, and there was much demand for land, especially land near Manila, where the transportation was cheap, if it could be by river. And the friar haciendas became an object of irritation and envy to many other people, to Filipinos. In some cases, it was rather an excuse to bring accusations against the friars. The real reason for the anti-friar movement was political and nationalist. But if you could find other things to accuse them of, well, so much the better. No? And there's no doubt that some of the orders became quite wealthy by the end of the 19th century. As the American government felt when it came in that it had to buy these haciendas, and it paid $7 million for the haciendas theoretically to distribute them to small Filipino farmers. And of course, most of them ended up in the hands of big Filipino farmers or of American companies, agricultural companies. But it saved the Jesuits from being accused on that basis. The Jesuits would also be fortunate at the time of the nationalist movement in that they had lost their university, but the university had always had only a small number of Filipinos. It had been mostly for Spaniards, and it was true of Santo Tomas also. There were very few Filipinos who went on for higher education unless they wanted to be priests. But even then, they wouldn't go on for the graduate degrees. Whereas by the middle of the 19th century, well-to-do Filipinos and even less well-to-do Filipinos were looking for an education, and a modern type education. And if you read the novels of Rizal, he makes quite odious comparisons between the students at the Ateneo who studied very hard and very seriously, and those at Santo Tomas who didn't do any study at all. And he also makes comparisons between the Jesuits and the Dominicans. Well, the Dominicans naturally were carrying on their tradition, where the Jesuits were starting a new school and used new methods that they had brought from Spain. And therefore, the Ateneo influenced far more Filipinos in that period between its becoming a secondary school in 1865 and the Revolution than the University of San Ignacio and the other provincial colleges of the old society had been able to do. Basically, you can say the old universities of San Ignacio and Santo Tomas also, all they did was to prepare priests and lawyers, and those were the only things that they really taught. where if you look at the Ateneo Municipal's curriculum in the 1880s, it was demanding 2 or 3 modern languages besides Latin and Greek, and science and philosophy as well, all on the secondary level. So it was, many feel that the 19th century Ateneo was better than the 20th century Ateneo from some points of view.
Now let's backtrack a little bit to San Ignacio. What would you say was the significance of the Colegio de San Ignacio when it was first set up during the first period, the first Spanish period?
Well, it provided the first education above the primary level in the Philippines, and though in the beginning it was all for Spaniards, by the end of the 17th century you did have Filipinos beginning to enter it, and of course, as with all education, once you open people's minds, then they begin to see things in a new way and begin to think for themselves in a way which they might never have done without education. It certainly became the center for all Jesuit work in the Philippines in that early period. Specific details on it, we don't have very much, but as I say, it provided a place where it was even beginning to provide a place where people from other Asian countries who were Christian could come and also study in a way which was impossible in their countries. Though he went to Santo Tomas rather than to San Ignacio, the first Chinese bishop, Gregory Lo, whom the Spaniards called Lopez, studied here in Manila, and similarly the first Vietnamese martyrs studied here at Letran, or the Dominicans were working in Vietnam. The Jesuits, of course, worked in China and Japan, and there they had their own schools, so that the Philippines didn't have much influence on the other Asian countries for the Jesuits.
Father, my final question for the morning. If we look at these 2 periods, the Spanish Jesuit period in the history of the Jesuits in the Philippines, what would you say are some of the lessons that we can learn? Like maybe some of the things some of the good things that the Jesuits have done and some of the things that they could have done. Would you be able to cite some of your insights, perhaps?
In this first period?
The first 2 periods, Father.
Well, I think in the first period, say up to the expulsion, the work of the Jesuits was quite satisfactory, though they could have done more towards creating a Filipino clergy sooner, although it depended on the bishops, in fact, to ordain them, and they did educate them. When bishops decided to ordain Filipinos, they They did educate them. It was a limited accomplishment. The other problem that I see was that there was often great competition and even antagonism between the different orders, and a lot of time was wasted on lawsuits before the audiencia, and over things which today seem very trivial, questions of who should precede whom in the processions and things of that nature. I think that perhaps the Jesuits and Dominicans were most that way, because both of them are primarily intellectually oriented orders, and therefore they tended to watch out for their privileges. In the second period, I think the work in Mindanao was admirably done.
Okay, Father, let's take it from the second period. What are some of the lessons we can learn from the Jesuits' experience in the second Spanish period?
In the second period, the Jesuits certainly contributed a great deal to the growth of a Filipino nation, in the sense that the Ateneo Municipal, as Rizal would say, almost all of us were educated by the Jesuits, and though they didn't teach us nationalism, they've taught us all that is good and all that is best. And I believe that was true, that the type of education they got there did open people's minds. On the other hand, what they never could understand is why all these people who were good students then went to Spain and became Masons and gave up the practice of their religion. And I think one would have to argue that the religious instruction was not at the intellectual level of the other instruction at the Ateneo. Now, part of this is the 19th century church. And the 19th century church was fighting against the modern world in Rome and everywhere, and especially in Spain. And the Jesuits were caught up in that. But they didn't have enough foresight to see that that there was something wrong in the education that they were giving. Later, when Rizal was in Dapitan, Father Pablo Pastels, his former teacher, would send him a book, and Rizal wrote back saying, courteously but somewhat sarcastically, that I read that book when I was in the Ateneo, and though it's the kind of book that impresses certain kind of people, I don't find it very convincing. However, because it comes from you, even if all the pages were blank, I'm very grateful for it. But it shows that his they simply were not coming into contact with modern thought. And Rizal would say to Padre Faura, that science is not the whole of the modern world. You have to think of the philosophy of the modern world. The other major contribution the Jesuits made, of course, was the Escuela Normal, the normal school for men, which the government founded, but which the Jesuits then took over, and it trained teachers for the primary schools who could teach in Spanish. Now, this is the first time that you have large numbers of Filipinos, ordinary Filipinos, who going to the barrio schools could learn Spanish. They were much accused for this, and they foresaw what accused of undermining Spanish rule in the Philippines by teaching Spanish to the Filipinos. And there's one letter where the superior says, we realize that there may be some truth in this, that when we help people to come into contact with things outside their world, they may turn against Spain and throw off the Spanish yoke. But he said, if that happens, well, at least we will have the satisfaction of knowing that we helped the nation to form itself under Spanish auspices, if it should become independent by itself. So some of them were conscious that the friars, many of the friars, wanted their school, the Jesuit schools, closed because they felt that they were creating nationalism and were endangering Spanish rule. Some Jesuits saw that, but felt that they should go ahead doing it because they had a duty to develop people's minds as best they could. And how they used their minds, that was up to them. But there were others who were quite negative towards the whole nationalist movement. When the revolution came, the Jesuits were not bothered. They were able to say Mass for the revolutionaries and to remain outside the city walls and, at the observatory, and nobody asked for the expulsion of the Jesuits when the Malolos Constitution ordered the expulsion of all the friar orders, and that there was nothing against the Jesuits or the Vincentians, who were only small numbers and running the seminaries. But so I think they did achieve a great deal towards helping the Filipino nation to come to the point where it could make itself independent. But they failed to see all the implications of it, and therefore, and particularly, they failed in providing a religious background. What I said about the failure to give an intellectual religious background to people, I think has been shown most clearly in the books of Father Bonoan on when he discusses the correspondence between Father Pastels and Rizal, that Rizal knew far more about both Catholic teaching and anti-Catholic teaching than Pastels did. That was one of the weaknesses, I think, of the period. The Jesuits were not given the facility to form their own men intellectually in Spain, and though they came here with what was admired by Filipinos in comparison with what was being done by the other orders, it really was not not at the level that we would look for in a school of higher education today.
Anything else you'd like to add, Father, before we wrap up the interview this morning?
I don't think so.
Thank you.